Els Conservancy for organising this, and to Gareth and the Drummond Arms for hosting this. It's really appreciated. So let me just introduce myself. My name's Stephen, and I've been in Rooi Els for about a year now. I've been doing photography for about 7 years, and astrophotography for most of that, but it's always been something where I've had 2 or 3 times a year where I'm somewhere where the skies are dark enough where I can get decent astrophotos. And so moving out to Rooi Els and having this year-round where you can take astrophotos from your house, I think is a real blessing. And I think the fact that we have dark skies here and most people comply with keeping the external lights off is a really amazing thing. It gives us the opportunity to take these sorts of astrophotos from your home. So I'm going to be tailoring this session to people who are complete beginners and don't understand the technical aspects of photography. So if you are familiar with photography, things may be a bit basic for you, but I'm also going to try to keep it generic enough that this is something that you can apply to your own phone or your own camera to get these photos. So guys, if there are any questions as we're going along, please feel free to stop me and ask. There may be stuff that we'll be covering later on in the session, and in those cases we'll just push it out, but yeah, happy to answer any questions as we go along. So the topics that we're going to be covering in this session, if you like, I can also just give you a bit of background about some of these photos that I've taken as well. So this is a place called Rusty Gate Farm out in near Grayton. And so this was a star trail. I sat out on the dock for about an hour and a half taking photos of the stars. So you can see in star trails, the center of this circle is the celestial southern pole. So the Earth is rotating around that axis. And so this is why you see all of these stars here. And so this picture was about 120 photos that I took, and then you stack them together afterwards. And then one of these exposures, you can see some people came out to have a swim and left a nice trail in the water of them jumping on and taking a swim there. And then I also processed this together with a photo of the Milky Way and then combined them together in Photoshop to give you this effect that we've got here. So the topics we're going to be covering is looking at the types of astrophotography that there are. We're going to be looking at, trying to figure out my, so we're going to be looking at the equipment that you need. I'm going to be talking about the exposure triangle, because when we're shooting astrophotography, we're doing everything in manual, so we need to understand a little bit about how that works. Then we'll be looking at the camera settings that you're going to need. How we actually shoot the stars. And then some additional resources that you can use after the session as well. I'm also going to be sharing this presentation after the session and putting a video up on YouTube of this whole talk as well. So if you'd like a copy of it, if you haven't signed up on the form, I can send out the link to the presentation to everyone who's signed up via the form. And if you haven't and you'd like to, please just come up and give me your email address and your phone number afterwards, and I'll share this with you after this session. Okay, so then if we look at the types of astrophotography that we have. So there's several different types. First of all, we've got solar astrophotography. So this is where you actually take pictures of the sun. This was back in 2016 where we had a partial solar eclipse and took a photo with my Nikon bridge camera, which had a 60 times zoom. And so if you're taking photos of the sun, you have to use what's called a neutral density filter, which reduces the amount of light coming in. If you don't have a neutral density filter on when you're taking solar photos, this can permanently damage your camera, can damage your sensor and burn holes into your sensor. So yeah, if you are trying to take photos of the sun, please do make sure you've got that installed. Lunar photography. So lunar photography is where you're using a long zoom lens and you're taking photos of the moon. So this was with with a Tamron 600mm lens, and then this as well. So there's also techniques that I'll be briefly covering called stacking, which is where you take multiple photos of the same thing and you combine them in software afterwards. So in this case, the original photos weren't anywhere near as sharp, but then when you stack 55 photos together, it enhances all of the details and lets you really bring out that sharpness. Then we've got Milky Way photography. So this is where you're taking photos of the Milky Way. You've got the galactic core, which is going across here. You can see this is what they call the galactic kiwi here, which is that shape in the galactic core, which if you look at it upside down looks a little bit like a kiwi. And this photo was Coral Bay Beach, and there was bioluminescent waves in the background breaking blue, and I have some LED equipment, and I took a long exposure and combined those photos together afterwards. And you can see here as well, we've got that green glow, and that's called air glow. So that air glow is when you've got ionization of atoms in the atmosphere, and it can make the sky glow green or red or purple, depending on where in the atmosphere that this hits. Then we have aurora photography, so not one of mine this is from NASA's site, something that's on my bucket list to get photos of one day, but not something I've been lucky enough to experience, although we did have air glow in Rooi Els the other day, which had the air bright green glowing and moving like the aurora, which was pretty amazing, but yeah, definitely something I'd like to do one of the days, going to Iceland or somewhere like that to actually capture that. Then we have deep sky photography. This is usually when you're using a telescope or something along those lines, and these are very high focal lengths. These are going to be extremely complex to do. You're taking hours of photographs in different light spectrums and combining them afterwards, so it's a very complex and convoluted process, and you have to have specialized equipment. You're kind of starting at like 30,000-40,000 rand there if you want to get decent stuff for properly tracking the deep sky. So this is again something from NASA and not something I've done yet, but again something that is on my bucket list to do. And then we have star trails as well. So this is when you're taking multiple photos of the sky over the course of the night, and then you're combining them in software afterwards to give you the passage of the stars as the Earth rotates and the stars move relative to the sky. And so with this one, I also, I really pushed the saturation up to bring up the colours of the stars. But these are actually the star colours. We just see them as white, but you can see you've got the oranges and you've got the reds and you've got the blues and things. And this is actually the real star colours that we're seeing. But as I say, obviously just enhanced quite significantly to bring it out. Okay, so then if we talk about the equipment that we need, so most of these days. Most of the modern smartphones are able to take really decent pictures. Some of the smartphones that have been made in the last 2 years, you can take really good astro shots. So if you are looking to get into it though, the basic equipment is that you want a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, which has the ability for you to change lenses. A tripod to hold your camera steady, a headlight or torch, and ideally something that's got the ability to it's got a red headlight, because when you're in the dark there, anytime you turn on a white light, it messes up your night vision, and it takes about 20 minutes for your night vision to recover. So using a red light at night helps to preserve that, and just makes your life easier when you're out in the field. And then warm clothes, obviously, because astrophotography could be a long process, and you can be out there for hours. And yeah, bringing something to drink and some warm clothes and a stool if you really want to get into it. But yeah, it's also really key to make sure you're properly prepared for it. And then the additional items that you can also look at as well. So you can get different types of photos depending on the lenses that you have. So having the other wide angle lenses to get Milky Way photos, or zoom lenses to get those deep sky photos or moon photos. If you want to get really into it, then going to telescopes, where you can attach your camera to a telescope and take photos of the night sky. As I say, those are more difficult because they've also got the problem that as the Earth rotates, the stars move in the sky. And the further you're zoomed in, the shorter the amount of time you can take a photo for. So you have to get what's called a sky tracker. And what that does is that rotates your telescope or your camera at the same speed as the Earth rotates. So you can keep the same part of the sky in focus for a longer period of time. And so both telescopes and sky trackers have that. You can have lighting, because it can be nice to also light your foreground as well. So being able to light up the trees with a headlight, or using your torch to illuminate parts of your picture. And you do it very briefly, just so you don't want it to overblow the night, overempower the night sky. But you can use light to selectively light your scenes as well. And then you've also got filters. So, for example, you get filters that will block out sodium lighting. So it cuts out the sodium light from the night sky, and it makes your photos better as well. And we're not going to be getting into much detail on the additional equipment. I'm just it's stuff that you can read up on if you do get into it, or if you are interested. And if you do want to have more information about any of this afterwards, you can just come and chat to me as well. Okay, so then if we look at what's important if we're deciding to buy a camera for astrophotography. So the key is going to be, the main thing that we're really looking for is our low light performance. So astrophotography, you're taking photos in the blackest possible conditions that you can get. So you want to be able to process that afterwards to be able to bring out as much light as you possibly can. So you can see that one of the problems that you have when you're taking photos is that you get what's called noise in your photo. So you can see in this top photo it's quite grainy and you've got lots of speckles of noise, and whereas this lower photo you don't have that same noise in the photo. So a lot of that is determined by your camera body, and then also the size of the sensor that you have on the camera. So inside your camera there's a sensor that is what captures the image when you open your shutter. And you can see that this goes up in size from your older phones were from like the iPhone 13, your Pixel 6, and then this is where we first move into our digital cameras, is our Micro Four Thirds. So you can see that this sensor is significantly bigger than your camera sensors, and which means that generally as the sensor size gets bigger, your ability to take photos in low light gets better as well. So it captures more light on that sensor. So the best photos that you're going to get are from your full frame cameras, like your Nikon D850 or your Canon R6. Then you've got your cropped frame cameras as well, which can also take very decent photos as well. But it just doesn't have the same low light performance as your full frame cameras. So if you are looking to get into it, it's perfectly fine to start with what you have, and then perhaps move up to a crop sensor, and then a full frame if you decide it's something that you really want to do, because it's also, as these get bigger, typically it gets more expensive as well. So your full frame cameras, the camera or the lens, is typically going to be a lot more expensive than it is if you're buying a crop frame camera. So then, also, if you look at the camera that you're buying, you also want to just make sure that it's got decent lenses available for it for astrophotography as well. If you've got, if you buy a Fuji or an Olympus, for example, it may not have the lenses, you may not have the lenses readily available. And with camera gear as well, you can very easily go to second-hand gear and have that being performing 90% as well as brand new gear. So, you know, so the second-hand market is probably the way you want to go. And so take a look at the availability of gear in places that are nearby you and where you may want to buy camera gear.
And if you've got is there a built-in lens, or can you have an older camera that you can then put on a low-light lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So any of the SLRs or the DSLRs, they've got interchangeable lenses, so that you can take off your current lens that you've got on there and then put on an astro-specific lens, because you've got certain lenses are just better for astrophotos. The stars are sharper and they're better in the corners and they give you better quality photos. So, you know, and you can get some of them for quite cheap, but it's just about knowing which types of lenses you want to get and doing your research beforehand. So, because there's a vast array of stuff out there, and trying to find decent lenses for astrophotography. You know, I bought a couple for my Nikon for about 6,000 or 7,000 rand, and I've got a couple of astro-specific ones, and those are like manual focus, kind of entry-level type lenses, but take really amazing astrophotos. So most of my photos are with those. Cool. Then for cameras as well, then you're also looking at the features that you've got. So there's certain things that may make your life easier when you're taking astrophotography. Some of them have got time-lapse features in, so you could take hundreds of photos one after the other. Most cameras these days have that availability. Some of the Olympus cameras have the ability to automatically track the rotation of the Earth in camera without having to have a separate tripod or separate equipment and things like that. So you've got certain astro features that some are better for. You've got some cameras which are astro specific. So your normal camera sensor, it blocks out a lot of the red light because it doesn't make for normal good photos. But if you install what's called a hydrogen alpha filter on your camera, then that lets you see all of the red light. You see the red nebulas in the sky and all of these sorts of things. So you do get astro-specific cameras as well that have all of that built in. And then obviously price, because camera gear is generally, you get what you pay for, and the more you spend, the better your gear is going to be and the better quality photos you're going to get. So that's a general rule, and there's odd exceptions, but not too many. So it's always just balancing what you want to spend with how interested you are in the quality of the photos that you're getting out. Then, if we're looking at what's important when we're looking at a lens, so the focal length is going to be really key for us. So you can see, so this is a photo again at Kuchel Bay when we had the bioluminescence, and this was taken at 14 millimeters. So this was my rocking on 14 millimeter lens. So this was this is like a 6,000 lens or something like that. And so this is what the field of view looks at, at 14 millimeters. Then if I had an 18 millimeter lens, 24, 35 and 50 millimeter lens, you can see that my field of view becomes narrower, and it also reduces the length of time that I can take that my photo can be as well. I'll go into the details on that a little bit later. But so first of all is going to be your focal length. Typically when you're starting astrophotography, you want to get a wide angle lens because it just means it's easier to take the photos. You can get better results with less effort on a wide angle lens, and it also allows you to get in a huge portion of the sky as well, which you know, with astrophotography, having as much sky as possible in your picture is usually better. So then the next thing that you'd be concerned about is the aperture of the lens. So the aperture is how wide open that lens can go and how much light it can let in. So you'll have a value like f2.8 or f3.5 or something along those lines, and that talks to what the aperture of your camera is and how much light it can let in. So in astrophotography, the more light you can get, the better. So if you can get a f1.4 camera or f1.8, so that's going to be a lot better than most of the standard kit lenses which come. They come with usually being able to take it to start f3.5 or something along those lines. So that affects two things: the aperture. It affects how much of your how much light you can get in, and how much of your photo is in focus as well. So a smaller aperture, so a f1.4, you've got a very small part of the photo which is in focus, and whereas with if you're shooting at f11, you've got most of the photo in focus. So with astrophotography, we're looking for as low an aperture as possible. And then we also have the sharpness and the coma. So coma is when your stars in your photo aren't perfectly round. It's more advanced, and it's not something you necessarily are too worried about when you start, but again, it comes down to some lenses are better at that, at rendering circular stars. You get some lenses when you're taking those photos, they come up as ovals in your picture, and it just doesn't make for as pleasing a photo. So that can be, the sharpness and the coma can be important as well, again, depending on how seriously you're taking your photography. For those as well, it's typically better to just do some research beforehand to read up on it, because it's not something that you'll be able to know really without actually experiencing it or without reading a review for that lens. And then the third part of it is a tripod. So having a good tripod is really essential. It's you can, when you're starting out, you can make do with just using a beanbag or a pillow or something along those lines, but having a good tripod is really key to getting good astro photos, because you're generally going to be taking photos at 20 or 25 seconds long. And if you've got any vibration, or if the tripod head moves at all during that time, then it ruins your photo, because it needs to be perfectly still for the duration of that. So having a good tripod, I've gone through multiple cheap tripods before I actually decide to spend the money and actually buy a decent tripod. And a cheap tripod will usually do you for a few months, and then the head starts getting loose, and it's just not fit for purpose anymore. So typically with tripods, if you're going to be getting one, I'd recommend spending a little bit more from the start and getting a decent one, because you are going to just be replacing one otherwise if you're planning to do this for any length of time.
Stephen, how do you trigger the camera? Do you use a remote?
Yeah, so you've got a couple of options. You can do the remote. Yeah, exactly. So you can do the remote. You've got some of the cameras have a countdown feature, so you can do that. Or otherwise, you can set an interval timer, and you set it to take multiple photos one after the other. So then it's also, if there's a little bit of wind, it maximises the chances that you've got at least one or two of those photos that don't have any shake and move.
Okay. Sorry, just on that question, what do you actually use? Because the problem is that with these new cameras, the remotes only operate, the sensors are on the front of the camera. So you actually have to stand obliquely in front of the camera about 20 degrees to operate the remote on the camera.
Really?
Does that not interfere with the photograph?
So I take a couple of different ways. I have just a normal remote. The cameras I have a sensor on the back and on the front, so that wasn't an issue. You also get plug-in ones as well. And then, but what I do most of the time is I've got a setting on my camera where it does a countdown, and then it takes 10 photos one after the other. So I set that and I push the shutter, and then it does a 10-second countdown before it starts taking the photos, and then I take 10 photos, because also I'm not going to get too detailed into it, but when I'm taking Milky Way photos, I'll always take multiple photos, and then I combine them together afterwards in a program to improve the quality of them. But yeah, usually having some sort of a timer function or something on there, and then pushing the button and then giving it a couple of seconds to settle. You also might want to have a panoramic head. So some of the some tripods have what's called a ball head, where your camera can move in any direction, and some have ones where you can move the vertical and the horizontal axes individually. So you may want to have that pan head. So if you want to get the full Milky Way in the image like this, so typically most cameras don't have a wide enough field, most lenses don't have a wide enough field of view to be able to capture the full arc of the Milky Way. So in this case, I took 7 different photos and I combined them into a panorama afterwards. So having a panorama head helps make sure you're keeping your horizon level and that your photos join together properly when you're stitching them together afterwards. And in addition to that, some tripods do have a level built into them, so you can make sure that you're shooting levelly as well. Can be useful. Most cameras have that built into the camera itself these days as well, so it isn't as useful these days as it used to be. Cool. So when you're looking at buying any gear, so it's very easy to fall into gear acquisition syndrome, where you just want to buy more gear as you start getting nicer photos and then you want to buy the next best thing. But the first thing is just deciding what type of photos you want to shoot. So the gear that you need for shooting the moon and the gear that you need for shooting the Milky Way are very different. So you think about what you first want to shoot, try getting the results with what you've got already. See what you can get, and only get new gear when it's not giving you the results that you want. Because you get to a point for me, I started out with a crop sensor camera, and I shot astrophotos on that for a year and a half, and then I decided it was about time to upgrade. And you get better results when you move to full frame. But you can get amazing results on crop sensor cameras as well. So this photo is a crop sensor. So this was Africa Burn in 2017, which is out in Tankwa Town near Sutherland. And so the night skies there are incredible. Really, just the Milky Way stretched across the night sky. And as I mentioned earlier, there's always going to be a trade-off between price and performance. So decide on a budget and work within that as well if you are going to be buying gear. Okay, so now we're going to be going into some technical detail of photography and talking about the exposure triangle. So if there are any questions during this part, it can be, if you have, please feel free to ask and stop me if I'm not explaining things well, or if you'd like any more information. So when we're looking at capturing photos of the Milky Way, the stars are incredibly dim in the sky, so what we need to do is we need to try and capture as much light as possible when we're taking that photo. So your camera doesn't know how to do this automatically. So there's 3 settings that we could use in order to increase the amount of light that our sensor is gathering during the time that the shutter is open. So these 3 settings are what we call the exposure triangle, and these 3 settings all affect the amount of light that's coming into your camera. So the first part of it is your aperture. So the aperture of your lens, and these are the settings that you should have on your phones as well. So if you set your phone to pro mode or your camera to manual mode, you should have the ability to change all of these settings yourself. So your aperture, so that's how wide open the lens is. So that's going to be a value like f2.8 or f4 or something along those lines. So it talks to how much light you're letting in, and the lower the value, the better. So if you're a wide aperture such as f1.4 gathers much more light than a low aperture like f11. The shutter speed is when you push the button on the camera, how long does the shutter stay open and expose your shutter to light before it closes again? So you want to leave your shutter open for as long as possible, But as we've already mentioned, the rotation of the Earth, there's a certain threshold you can get to before your stars start leaving trails in the sky. So you want to set your shutter speed to as high a value as possible where it doesn't introduce unwanted effects of star trailing in your sky. And then if you have, so for example, with star trails, you may want to take exposures of an hour and a half, but you generally don't want to do that in a single shot, because if you leave your camera taking an exposure for a protracted period of time, that can also introduce additional noise and graininess into your photos just from the heat of the camera as it's taking that photo. And then the final setting that we have is the ISO. So the ISO of the camera is how sensitive that camera is. So basically it takes the amount of light that's hitting that camera and it multiplies it. So it multiplies the brightness of the image, and so you can only do that so much before it starts introducing noise and introducing graininess into your photo. So there's also a trade-off between how bright you want your photos to be and how much noise you're willing to accept in your photos as well. So then this is basically our exposure triangle that we've got here. So you can see here we have ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And as it goes from 100 up to 25,600, this gets brighter as it goes up. So your 100 is your darkest, 200 is double the amount of light, 100, 400 is double that, and so on. So each of these means that you're gathering double the amount of light in your image. So again, your shutter speed, if we start a 30-second exposure is gathering the most, then your 15, 8, 4, 2, 1, and so on. So each of these steps is gathering half the amount of light as the one above it. And similarly on your aperture, so your aperture doesn't just double, your aperture times is by the square root of 2, which is 1.414, but it's basically, it goes f1.4 and f gathers double as much light as an f.2, 2.8, f4, 5.6, 8, 11, and 16. So you can adjust these three elements to try to bring in as much light as possible. So you want to push up all three of these settings so that you're getting in as much light as you can. So each of these steps, as it doubles, that's called a stop of light. So basically it just means that it's double the light that's being brought in. Are there any questions on this side of things? I know it could be a few different concepts to take in.
ISO, you can use quality.
So yes, so it depends. There's certain limits where you get to, and that's going to be camera dependent. So you get to certain levels where you can push, like for example on my crop sensor camera, if I pushed my ISO over 800, I didn't get good results. On my current camera, I can push my ISO to 12,800 and I can still get decent results. So it really depends on the camera that you've got and how much noise you're willing to accept. And I'll talk a little bit later about just some of the ways that you can also take that noise out of your photos afterwards. So it may be that you're willing to accept a really grainy and noisy photo because you can do things with it afterwards to actually bring it back and make it look good again.
Steve, you said that people don't have fancy cameras, iPhones and that. Can you adjust all those things on an iPhone?
Absolutely. So you can set it to Pro mode usually. So if you set it to Pro mode, and then you'll have all those settings that changes to be able to set. Yeah. So anything from any phones from the last 2 years generally are able to take very decent astrophotos. Okay, great. So then if we move on to the actual settings that we want to put in camera. So as I mentioned earlier, you want to try and gather as much light as possible. So as we saw in that exposure triangle, your aperture, you choose as wide an aperture as possible. So if you drop your aperture down, it can increase the sharpness in some lenses. In most cases, it's not something you're really going to worry about to start off with. So just set it to as low a value as possible. You can play around with it to see if it makes a difference to your photos, but most of that is kind of pixel peeping that you get to when you're really involved in making sure that you care about the quality of the photos so much. So then there's also the shutter speed, as we mentioned. You want to take the longest exposure you can until your stars start trailing in the image.
How do you interpret that triangle? That triangle implies that there are certain limits, correct? There are certain combinations that are not possible.
So basically it's all really going to be dependent on the gear that you've got. So if you, most cameras, you're going to start at ISO 100. That's your default ISO and that's your default sensitivity. So you can push this up. So cameras have a specific upper limit. So you might have an upper limit of 3,200, or you might have an upper limit of 118,600. So there's great limits between what your maximum sensitivity is depending on your camera, and you'll push it until the photo doesn't look good anymore. So it's about you try to set your maximum settings that you can, and then work downwards from there. And so if your camera can go to 25,600 ISO, then put it there and try it out and see what it looks like, and then try it at 12,800 and see what it looks like, and just see what gives you a photo that you think is exceptional.
But there's a sort of a sweet spot in that triangle for a given camera.
Yes, exactly. So if I look at, for example, if I'm shooting on my 14mm lens and on my Z6 II, which is a full frame camera. So I shoot at f2.8 because that's the widest that lens can go. I set my ISO to usually 3,200 because that gives me a decent level of noise in my camera. And then I set my shutter speed to 20 seconds because that's the maximum I can do on that lens before I start seeing trailing in there. If I put my 12mm fisheye lens on, I keep all of the same settings except that I set my shutter speed to 25 seconds because it's a wider lens and I can get a longer exposure before this starts trailing. So, but yeah, it's really about experimenting with the gear that you've got and seeing where the limits are for the equipment that you do have.
So the higher the ISO and the bigger the aperture, you can shorten the time to get the same light.
You can. So generally you want your ISO is the last thing you want to change. So you want to get your image as good as possible with a combination of shutter speed and aperture, and then your ISO is your last option because it starts making your pictures very easier. Okay. So as we said, so your aperture as wide as possible, your shutter speed as long as you can get on your combination of lens and camera, and we'll go into those guidelines next. And then your ISO is the maximum sensitivity where your pictures are so grainy that you're unhappy with them. Okay, so if we take a look at that maximum shutter speed, so this is the maximum length of time you can leave your shutter open before the stars start leaving trails in the sky. And this is a combination of when you've got a full frame, a crop sensor camera, or an iPhone, for example, and the focal length of your lens. So you can see as your focal length is longer, your full frames can take for a 14mm lens, your full frame can take 36 seconds, crop sensor 22 seconds for Canon, and 24 seconds for Nikon. And the reason for the difference between the Canons and the Nikons is that your Canons, your crop sensor zoomed in 1.6 times over a full frame, whereas your Nikons and your Sonys and your Olympuses and Fujis 1.5 times. So that's why you do have some slight differences in these. And these are just guidelines as to what your maximum exposure time should be. So they say, for example, 14 mil, 36 seconds. And if I do that, I'm not happy with how much trailing there is in the star. So I do a 20-second exposure. So it's guidelines to where you can start on. Okay. Okay, so the next part of the process, so those are our three settings that we're going to be using to get as much light as possible. So the next part is actually focusing on the stars. So your camera can't focus on the stars. The stars are far too dim for it to be able to use it as a focal point. So you're going to have to switch to manual focus for this. So the steps that you'll follow here is that you will mount your phone or your camera on your tripod, and you put it roughly in the position where you want to take your photo. You then, if you've got a SLR camera or a mirrorless camera, you want to switch on your live view mode. So the setting where your image is displayed on the screen at the back of your camera. So that does two things. It's especially if you've got an SLR, you're not going to be able to see the stars properly through the viewfinder, and you want to be able to see the focus on it. And the second thing it does on SLRs as well, it also puts your mirror into an up position so that when you take your photos, that doesn't flip up and it can cause a vibration which also ruins your photos as well. So you set live view onto your camera, or you're then going to want to point that at one of the brightest stars that you can see in the sky. So try and point it at, doesn't have to be exactly where you're looking at, but you point it at one of the brightest stars of the sky, and then zoom in as far as you can. So you're zooming in, so you're centered on that star, and it's as bright as possible. And then you need to manually adjust your focus ring until that star turns into a pinprick of light. So it will start out as like a big out of focus ball, and you need to be very carefully change your focus until that becomes as sharp as it possibly can. So that's the way that you focus on the star. So again, you switch to live view, point at a bright star, zoom in as far as possible, and manual focus. And once you've done that, you can zoom back out, and then you can leave that focus locked. So you want that to be manual focus, and you can leave that focus locked in for the rest of the night, because it's now set to infinity basically, and so it's going to be, your stars are going to be in focus. So if you move your camera around, you're not going to generally have to refocus on the stars again.
So can't you set directly to infinity also?
You can, but generally, so it's got an infinity setting. I've found very few lenses where the infinity setting gets your camera properly sharp. So you may have some lenses where setting it to infinity is fine, but I've found it's never completely sharp at that setting. Okay. And then, so once you've focused in on that star, you zoom back out and you can compose your shot. Okay, so yeah, and again, this is something you can do on your phones as well. You're just switching from AF to NF. Typically, if it's on your camera, you'll have a switch on your lens or on your body that has an AF, NF, and you'll just need to switch that to NF to switch it to manual focus.
Sorry, stupid question. So zooming in and out doesn't change your focus?
No, so you're going to do the digit. So sorry, I should have been more clear. So rather than zooming actually on the lens itself, you're doing your digital zoom on the back of your camera. So you're using the plus and minus buttons on the back of your camera, or you're pinching and zooming on your phone just to get that in focus. So on your phone, if you're on your camera, if you're using those plus and minus buttons to zoom in, it's not actually changing your focal length, it's just changing the zoom on the actual page. Yeah. So other settings we may want to change as well. So changing your white balance. So white balance in camera is basically, it tells your camera this is the point where this is what white looks like. So it could make your photo, if your white balance is off, your pictures could look too yellow or too blue, for example. And again, the white balance is something you may be happy with your automatic settings, but you may also want to change that as well. So if you do change your white balance, it changes how orange or blue the Milky Way looks in the sky to you, and it's really going to be personal preference. You can do it typically anywhere between, if you've got a manual white balance setting, you can set it to anywhere between 3,200 and 4,800 Kelvin. Those are typically the ranges that you use. I usually set mine to about 3,700 Kelvin when I'm taking photos of the Milky Way. That gives it a natural kind of look with the yellowish type of feel to the stars. So that's typically where I will start there. Then changing your picture settings. When you're capturing your images, if you've got a pro mode, you'll also just want to go into your settings and take a look at your photo format. Because most cameras and phones have the ability to shoot in either JPEG or RAW. So the difference between JPEG, basically your camera takes a photo and your camera interprets, this is what I think the photo looks like, and applies a set of colours to it. If you take a RAW photo, what happens is the camera takes the photo, it takes your full range of data from across the spectrum, and it keeps it all in the image. So you have the ability to edit your photos a lot further before you start getting artifacts in your images or where they start losing quality. So you're always going to want to shoot in RAW mode if you have the ability to do it. As I said, you'll set your camera to live view mode so that you can focus on the stars properly, and also so that your mirror doesn't vibrate when you take that photo and cause the image to be blurry. And then also, depending on the type of photo that you're taking, you may want to enable your multiple exposure setting, which then just allows you to do star trails or time lapses of your shots as well. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you can take multiple images and stack them afterwards to improve the quality as well. Okay, so if we look at what actually goes into shooting, doing an astrophotography shot, I think more than any other type of photography, well, from my perspective at least, maybe not for everyone, but the planning part of astrophotography is really significant because there's a lot of factors that you need to take into account, and generally you've got quite a short time window that you've got available to get decent astrophotos. So you've got your planning, your shooting, and your post-processing. So most people don't necessarily do anything to their photos after they're done with them, except maybe adding a filter or two. But if you want to get decent astrophotos, making some changes to them afterwards is almost essential. So I'm going to be giving a high-level view on the processing side of things, but I'm going to be putting together some videos and put it on the post-processing side, and I'll also share them afterwards as well. So if we look at the planning side of things, so there's lots of things you have to take into account. So the location where you're planning to shoot. So obviously you want somewhere that's picturesque, that has dark skies, that doesn't have a lot of light pollution around there. So yeah, you'll want to find somewhere that's got dark skies. What is the moon doing? So for about half of the month, the moon is too bright for you to be able to get photos of the Milky Way. So if you've got more than around a quarter moon, your astrophotos are going to be washed out by the moon overpowering them, and you're not really going to get decent photos. So it's important to take a look at what the moon's doing. I use an app called Phases of the Moon on my phone, and that will tell you what your different phases are and what the moonrise and moon set times are, so you could plan around that. Then you also need to be, it's about having not just having the location, the dark skies, it's also having the weather as well, because if you've got some cloud cover or if you've got a bit of rain or a bit of wind like we're not really averse to on this side of the world, it can completely ruin your chances of getting any decent astrophotos, because you can't take a 20-second exposure without wind. Right? So yeah. So then also the time of year as well. So as it showed you the Milky Way galactic core as well. So that also rotates through the sky over the course of the night, but then also over the course of the year as well. So you can only see the galactic core from around February to November. So outside of those, you can see the tail of the Milky Way, but you don't get the full cluster of stars right in the centre of it. So yeah, the time of year that you're looking at. And then when you're planning as well, you also want to try and think about what's your subject going to be. So are you going to be shooting the stars? Are you going to be shooting the moon? Are you going to be shooting deep sky? And then if you're shooting Milky Way, do you have a foreground subject as well? Because just taking photos of the stars by themselves can be amazing, but typically if you've got something in the foreground to keep it interesting, it just adds to the photo, it gives it additional impact if you've got a foreground subject as well. So then also just doing your checklist before you go out to shoot. So have you got all of your gear, your cameras, your lenses, your filters, your lights, your batteries? You know, it's nothing worse than getting somewhere and then you realise you've got half a battery of life and you can't take the photos that you want to. So doing all these checks before you go out as well. So here if you're living here with dark skies, it's obviously less of an issue because you can get these things from your cupboard. But if you're going to be going out on a trip to try and take photos, then it's going to be more important to do all of these checks. So then actually taking the photo. So your steps that you're going to do when you're out in the field is you're first going to mount your camera, you frame your subject, you understand what you're going to be taking a photo of, apply your settings, your default settings for your aperture, your ISO, your shutter speed, and your white balance. Manually focus on a bright star, so focus on the bright star, zoom in and change your manual focus. Zoom back out and compose your shots again so it's as you wanted it. Take a test shot and then review and retry and adjust your settings as necessary. So if you take a photo and you take a look at it and zoom right in and see, is the amount of grain that I've got in this photo acceptable? Am I happy with this, or do I need to reduce my ISO? Are the stars sharp enough in this photo? Do I need to reduce my shutter speed, or are they a little bit out of focus? So it's going to be just playing around with these settings and figuring out what works for you, because every camera and every lens is going to have different capabilities, and so it's about trying it out with what you've got and playing with these settings until you find a mixture that works for you and works for that gear that you do have.
So this would be, because I take photos of anatomy, so on my phone it looks amazing, and then when I look on my iPad, there's some graininess.
Yeah.
So that would be, explain.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And so generally smartphone cameras, they generally give you a nice looking photo, but if you're really doing a lot of processing and if you're going into these sorts of photos which are really challenging on your gear, trying to take these photos in the dead of night and expect your camera to do enough to give you good quality photos when you're pushing them up, it can be difficult,
So you said that would use a sport?
Lightroom. Lightroom. I'll show you that now. So,
Part of the pixelation as well is also because of the format of the image. So
Yes.
if you're doing it in JPEG, you're going to get more pixelation than a raw image. Is that
no, not necessarily. The main difference between them, so your raw photos can be just as, or your JPEG photos can be just as sharp as your raw. It really depends on how much you want to edit them afterwards, because if you want to edit them afterwards, JPEG photos are not great for that, because if you change the colours too much, or if you start bringing up the shadows too much, it introduces a whole load of artifacts, because you're asking the picture for data that it doesn't have anymore, because it got discarded when it created that JPEG. Yeah, so basically, when a JPEG, the camera says, this is the colours that I think this photo should have, and then it throws away all of the rest of the data. Whereas a raw photo says, this is all of the data that you captured, and do what you want with it.
So the images are so big, files.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're talking about then, after you've taken your photos, so doing astrophotos, it's almost essential for you to do post-processing. So if I look at this photo here that I had on the front page, this was what it originally looked like when I got it on my camera. So you can just basically see it, and so that was how it came out of camera, and that was the result after processing. So and that's also the power of RAW. So if I had taken a JPEG image of that, I wouldn't have all of this data that still allows me to bring up all of these shadows and bring up all of the exposure to get all of the details out there. So yeah, so so your post-processing is really going to be an essential part of it to be able to really bring the most out of your astrophotos. So I typically use a program called Lightroom, which is Adobe Lightroom, and it's a fairly simple program. It's powerful. There's a huge amount of features, but you can get used to the basic features quite easily. There's other programs that you can use. You can use Capture One on your PC. You can use Snapseed on your mobile phone, or you can use Lightroom Mobile on your phone as well. There's other programs that we can use, such as a program called Sequitur, which, as I mentioned earlier, you can stack those photos together to create star trails or to reduce the amount of noise in your photos as well. So there's also that sort of post-processing. And then you also can do things where you're taking multiple exposures of the sky in the foreground. So when these settings that we've been talking about, these are to properly expose your sky, and usually you can get a decent photo of your foreground as well. But because you're shooting at such a wide aperture, you've got a very small part of your picture that's in focus, and you're focused on the stars. So generally your foreground is going to be out of focus and it's not going to look great. So you can also do something where you then keep your tripod in the same position, and then you change your focus so you're focusing on the foreground instead. You put a wider aperture, so you shoot at f8 for example, and then instead of 30 seconds or 20 seconds, you shoot it for 5 minutes. So you take a long exposure at a wider aperture, so you're then getting your foreground in focus as well. So you've got two photos, one with the stars in focus, one with the foreground in focus, and then you can combine them together afterwards in Photoshop. So there's a lot of advanced techniques that you can get into, and I'm not going to go into the details of them. So just a few programs that you can use as well. So as I mentioned, Phases of the Moon lets you know when it's going to be good conditions for taking astrophotos. Stellarium, so Stellarium is an online, you've got an online version, so and what that is that allows you to plan your photos, because you can see exactly where the Milky Way is going to be at any point, and you can say, I want to see what the sky is going to look like from my location in 4 months' time at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, and it will show you exactly what the sky is going to look like, so you can plan your photos around that. And that's a free online resource that you can use as well, which lets you plan your photos out. Similarly, Photo Pills is an app on your phone that gives you that same sort of functionality as well. You can hold your phone up and get an augmented reality Milky Way on your photos, so you can guide it on your phone, so you can figure out what it's going to look like that night, and you can plan your photos during the day as well. As I mentioned, Lightroom, which is what I use for my photo editing, and I mean it's really an incredibly powerful program. And that one photo I showed you, I mean, it's just a small sample of what you can actually do with it, but you can dramatically change your photos and really bring out all of the details on that. So yeah, amazing program. There's a 30-day free trial available from Adobe's site. If you take out a subscription to Lightroom and Photoshop, it's $9 a month, I think it is. So it's not hugely expensive, but it is a subscription model. But you can get a 30-day free trial if you want to play around with it and see what it's able to do. But yeah, really incredible program. And then, as I said, if you're editing on your mobile device, you've got Snapseed as well, which gives you those same abilities to change the exposure and the highlights and the shadows, for example. And then just some of the programs that we talked about. So Sequitur and Star Stacks, those both do the same thing, where they can create star trails and Milky Way and stack your photos together to reduce noise. While I'm busy putting the guide together on how to edit your Milky Way photos, if anyone is looking for something, there's a guide that I'll be sharing in this YouTube site that gives you a basic guide to how to edit your photos for the Milky Way. Photographicspace.com is an amazing website that pretty much tells you anything you need to know about how to take photos of the nebulas or stars. It's got some really amazing resources on there. And then if you're looking at potentially buying a camera, you can also go to dpreview.com and you can go to any one of their camera reviews. And they've got an image quality comparison on there, so you can put you set your existing camera, you select the camera that you want, and you can set a RAW file and set my ISO to 3200. So then you can see side by side exactly how grainy those pictures look and how good those low light performance is going to be for your camera. So really great resource if you are looking at potential.
Stephen, what is that stuff on your picture?
That's a shooting star. So this was during the Geminids meteor show. So set up my camera and first photo shooting star going for it. So and that's about it, guys. If you do want to see any more of my photos, my page is called Manipulating Light, and you can see myself on Facebook or Instagram, or if you have any questions afterwards or you'd like any more info, you can just email me on this address as well. So, guys, thank you very much for your time and for coming out today. Are there any other questions before we close off?
Are you starting the beginners class now?
I realise it's a lot of info to take. It's quite a complex topic, and it's working your way through it bit by bit, because I try to minimise the amount of extra stuff because there's a lot more that we can go into. It's playing around with it and seeing what works and
Stephen, what typical time of night is the best time to take these shots?
So really any time after. So we've got what's called astronomical sunset. So after you have a normal sunset, there's still a bit of light in the sky, usually for another hour or so. And then after that, that's usually when the Milky Way is brightest, and that's when it's best to. But it also depends on. So the Milky Way, where it is in the sky changes from night to night. So if you take a look at something like Stellarium, that will tell you that your Milky Way core is rising at 1:30 this morning. And so it's going to be different from day to day, basically. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.